Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, welcome to all of you in California, Michigan, Florida, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, wherever it is you're joining us. We know we have a lot of different people joining in very different ways online, but we're grateful that you're here with us today. And so, a reminder here at Ethos, we take a lot of time to really study in depth what these words, phrases, all of it, what they mean to the original audiences. And so, because we spend so much time, we want to remind you again we are a tax deductible organization, and we really depend on you to continue helping fund what we do. And so, please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. Team up with us. And as always, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button, sharing that. We'd like to grow the YouTube channel along with everything else that's done really well, but we'd love to see that grow this year. And so, welcome again to Ethos Online. So, we're moving through our Christmas journey. We've decided we want to stop our Genesis study for just a little bit, and we're going to move into this Christmas journey for the next 3 weeks or so. And we want to just delve into what it really meant to these people during this first century, and then how to really understand it from a larger perspective if you were Jewish, looking at the whole Torah, and then how do we understand and engage with it in a responsible way today. Without removing things out of context, without making it overtly Roman rather than Jewish, all of those things are important to us. And so today we delve into, again, the series that we call The Promise, because really that's what this was really all about. It was a promise about new hope, right? A new reality, a new way to sojourn through life. And so a reminder again, for the Israelites, when they're writing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, their temple was destroyed 587 BC. However, for this first century people, they write in regard to 70 AD, where their temple was destroyed, where they lost tons of lives, men, women, children killed, murdered right there on the streets. If you weren't able to run to the hills there in that city, you were in a really bad place. Right? And this is why the writers will say, oh, to the people, we mourn to the people who are not able to run to the hills. This was not a reference toward a someday event, but one that had happened there in Rome. And so this is a response to a really broken, sad moment in Jewish history, much like 587 BC was in Babylon for the Jewish people. This is the Jewish response to another terrible moment. And so what do? They don't just look back. They also consider the Jesus moment, and they find ways to make connection, which we'll get into in a little bit. But this is why it was written when it was. And so Torah is a written response to the fears of assimilation. The Jesus movement, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, this is a response to the fears of assimilation and the fear that maybe their whole way of life, Judaism, might just be dead. It might be done away with. It might not last, right? This was their response. Jesus was their response. And so, welcome to the promise, right? Enter the promise, the new reality that's about to break forth. This was the promise. So today, let's talk about Christmas. Yeah, we're about to celebrate it. Let's talk about Christmas. I love delving into where some of these traditions come from, why they were enacted, maybe questioning some things, maybe engaging with some things deeper. That's what we'll do a little bit today. And I'm going to share with you a lot of interesting connections to New Testament, Matthew and Luke specifically, and then Old Testament. And we're going to look at where even some of these individual writers of that time, they borrow heavily from the old to create the new. And so I'm going to do a lot of that today. But first, let's consider Christmas. Christmas has morphed into something very different than this story of a young Jewish girl giving birth in Bethlehem. It's a very different story, right? It's a very different understanding. You would never have seen Christmas trees, crosses decorated with wreaths, all that kind of stuff. You'd never see that in first century. This tradition was not something they would do. Yes, they celebrated a form of Hanukkah, right, where they'd celebrate things later on. But Christmas was not something a Jewish person did. It's not something that a follower of Jesus was participating in, right? So where did we get all these ideas? Where did we get the tree, the log, the Yuletide log, all those things? Let me share with you, just for fun, some different things that have created the holiday today we know as Christmas. So first off, there's this Yule log, right? We sing about the Yule log. Very rarely do I even see people with actual Yule logs. I'll see like, cakes or fruit cakes decorated like Yule logs. Here's where this came from. The Scandinavians, long before Christmas is celebrated, they would come together every year for the feast of Yule. Yule log. Makes sense, right? Fires, they would be lit at every hearth at the night, and a Yule or a Yule log is brought in. It's burned on the hearth in recognition of the god, of course, Thor, right? And so they're hoping that this practice is a reminder that winter is going to end. And winter, for them, they understood winter was that Thor was up there fighting the ice gods. So apparently every season, Thor would go and he would fight the ice gods, and that's why we have snow and ice. And at some point, Thor will win. He'll be victorious, and we'll have summer again, right? That's where the Yule log tradition actually comes from. Now, some of you have wondered, what about the gift giving? Oh, right, it's the gift giving came from the wise men, right? That's often the story we tell. Not actually true. This is a tradition that came somewhere else. And so interesting to know, during a celebration in December, these individuals, they would take time to end quarrels. And so we would often have grudges with neighbors or whatever. And so wars would be interrupted. Slaves could rest. You could begin offering gifts to one another, like fruits, which would have been like a sign of fertility. Dolls, which would have been like a symbolic custom of human sacrifice, right? Candles, reminiscent of bonfires, like traditionally associated with solstice festivals. A mock king would have been chosen during this time area, and a mock king was chosen from a group of slaves or criminals. And although that was permitted, they would behave like in an unrestrained way. This was all happening in Rome in the first century, and truth be told, even before that. And so basically, he would have 7 days to rule. It was just kind of a joke. At the end, he's murdered, right? And you can understand that moment where Jesus, they have a mock king. That was very common to the Romans. The Saturnalia eventually degenerated into a week like of a long week of like debauchery that would happen, crime, giving rise to like the modern use term Saturnalia, meaning like a period of unrestrained revelry. So all of that's happening. They would give gifts. That particular ceremony, giving gifts, taking time to be free and all these things, that actually originates there in Rome. Interesting fact that most of us don't consider, right? It was adopted heavily later on, 200 AD and beyond, when they begin taking these common practices, saying, how do we put Jesus in the mix? How do we put the birth story in the mix? That's how they do it. Yeah? You learned something interesting. Yeah, that's an earful. Another thing, sun worship, right? All around the globe, there were celebrations that revolved around the winter solstice. We know this, right? The desire for winter to just end. This is what most people are doing. They want spring back. And so the dark night, it's a reminder it's not going to last that long. And so in Guatemala, this is an interesting picture here. Guatemala, on December 25, the Mayan Indians, like this is a very old ancient tradition. They would honor the sun god that they worshipped before they became Christians, with a dangerous ritual that they would call the polo volador, the flying pole dance. And so 3 men would climb on top of this 50-foot pole, and as one of them beats a drum, plays a flute, the other 2 men kind of wind the rope attached to this pole around 1 foot, and they jump. And if they land on their feet, it's believed that the sun god's going to be pleased. And if they don't, well, then the sun god is going to be displeased, right? These kind of things happened all around the globe. These festivals to celebrate the sun god, to look at Thor, the dark night. All of it was that the dark night is going to end, right? This is what they would do all around the globe. The sun's going to shine again. Now, what about the Christmas tree? That's an interesting one. Most of us will have Christmas trees. So many ancient cultures in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, used evergreens, and they would put these in their homes to celebrate, again, winter solstice, the reminder that there's green. It's not all white around us, right? We can have green. So even in early Egyptian history, many of you may not know this, Egyptians, they would actually fill their homes with green rushes, and they would honor Ra, the sun god, while in like your Northern Europeans, in the Celts, right? They decorated their their Druid temples, all of that with wreaths, and basically symbolizing everlasting life. So you have everything from like Northern Europeans to the ancient Egyptians, all celebrating something very similar, reminding themselves that like spring's coming again, new life is around the corner. And so later on, you'll be introduced to like the legend of Martin Luther cutting down a tree, placing small candles around it. We don't know if that's true or not, but all of it's interesting. But what I find fascinating about this holiday is that it's really just a big conglomeration of tons of different rituals all across the globe. And so the Jewish perspective finds its way in as well, doesn't it? And yeah, we've got this guy, right? Has more to do with J.C. Penney and selling stuff than it does anything. But Jesus, it's fascinating to me, the 25th, right? We celebrate Jesus' birth at a time when he would not have been born, right? The 25th of December is not the time you would have Jesus born. However, it was the Roman era, a Roman holiday that was deeply celebrated. And so again, Christianity is they're taking the Jewish tradition, mixing it with Roman, and they're kind of creating an interesting celebration. And whether you hate it, love it, agree with it, disagree with it, this is the reality. So Rome is taking on the narrative, and they're putting their own twist on the whole thing. And so Christians, they have weaved these traditions together. We've made it holy, right? We've done this. And so what's fascinating to me is these two traditions, they created this thing we call Christmas, which is going to be celebrated in every church, mostly around the nation. So I want to even move through a little deeper now. We've talked about traditions, rituals that we celebrate. Let's talk about the writers. The writers here, there's only two really that talk about the birth story. People forget that. There's 4 Gospels. Only 2 of them think it's important enough to talk about. And so it's really important here that we understand the perspective these 2 writers are taking. So understand this. When the Jewish writers are writing, they're not looking forward. They're actually looking back. That's important. Think about this. They're not looking forward. They're looking back. So again, 70 AD, temple's destroyed. They've already written about Moses, right? They've written about David. They've written about Daniel, the various leaders who led their people from captivity into new life. They've read those. They've written those things. So what they need now is a new narrative. But what they're going to do in this new narrative that's going to help them kind of in this bitter night of the winter, the winter solstice, that place they're feeling, what's going to get them through? They're going to look to Jesus. Jesus is going to be the new thing. But what's going to make it interesting is all of the stories are going to kind of be centered on him. This is why Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. All words that mean Torah. If you're Jewish, you understand that. I am Torah. I am all of those stories put into one. That's what the writers want you to know. They are putting the main stories, the main figureheads, all of this into one. This is why Jesus will go into the wilderness for 40 days, much like Moses for 40 years. You see all the connections come up, right? It's very obvious. And so Matthew and Luke are very Jewish. And so we have to understand the whole thing. what they're writing, it's written there in the temple, right? Assuming readers understood like literary traditions, Jewish stories of kings, symbols of power, the Jewish readers, they were cued in on all of this. It's not going to be, it's not going to be like us today. We will read these things today and we'll miss it. But during that time era, 70 AD, these were Jewish people writing to Jewish readers who have all lost so much, experienced so much persecution. It's not going to be, 150 years later, what you're going to see happen is that they're going to move to a point where there's no Jew left in this group. That'll be 150 years later, right? And again, I'm not against Gentiles. I am one, right? But that's what takes place. And so the whole story, the whole narrative is kind of taken hostage 150 years later. But the people writing it, right? Matthew and Luke, John, Mark, these are all Jewish individuals. And so everything they say is going to have really interesting connections that we might miss. Or we might even add some things that aren't there. For instance, look at this. Number one, what mode of travel? Ask yourself this question. Yell it out to the computer, TV, smartphone that you're on. What mode of travel did the wise men use? What mode of travel do you think they used? Right? Camels. That's right. We all know it. Go though, take a minute, read over the narrative now. Like hit the pause button. What you're going to notice is after you read this, you'll find out there's no camels. Where'd we get the idea of camels? Right? There's no actual camels. Why would we assume there's camels? Well, the truth is because we understand Matthew and Luke, they're looking back at Torah. They're inserting stories and elements of Torah into the new narrative. We'll understand, oh yeah, Isaiah 60, it's right there. Camelback. They came on camelback to the nation of Israel to bring gold and frankincense. Oh, right? We begin to make the connections. If you're Jewish, you see it immediately. Today, we just miss it, right? We just make assumptions, giant leaps that we don't understand how we got there. But for a Jewish person, they would have been picturing camels because they knew Isaiah 60 well. They knew that these foreigners were going to Israel and offering up these gifts of gold and frankincense. They would have made the immediate connections. We today miss it. Here's another question. How many of the wise men were there? Well, yeah, 3, right? 3 of them. However, Matthew 1, Matthew 2, read it over. What you'll find is they don't actually even give a number of how many. We know that there were 3 gifts, right? But how many other wise men? How many other gifts? Maybe there was a 4th wise man. He brought fruitcake. I don't know. We don't. The idea here, it's bigger than what we think, right? There was something deeper going on, and if you're Jewish, you would have made the connections. They would have been interesting to you. Today, we don't even realize a connection had been made. We just assume things because we aren't Jewish. So again, it's so important to understand. Next week when we delve into these, you're going to have a load of really interesting perspective of how to read these. Know this, Matthew, he's going to make Jesus appear like a king. So he's going to use a lot of language that is kingly, right? Whereas Luke, Jesus is not king. He's not like a divinic character. Jesus is more prophetic. So he's going to be more like a Moses. So you'll see all throughout the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is always being connected to like the Moses figure, right? Moving the people, the Joshua figure, moving the people through these really a lot of turmoil, a lot of brokenness. I'm calling them out of the wilderness into a new way of life. That's what Jesus will do for Luke because he is borrowing from those figures. It makes sense. When you think about the 2 narratives even, they don't line up. This is why when people try to make it a literal way, like this is literally how it happened, these 2 Gospels, the only 2 that talk about it, they don't agree. And there's some obvious differences here. Look at our little graph here. Matthew has the happy couple go from Bethlehem to Nazareth to Egypt, whereas Luke says, no, Bethlehem, baby's born on the road. It's a boy. And oh no, there's a census that happens. That's the whole reason. And then they end up in Nazareth. The two are very, very different tellings of why and what happened, right? Even when you look at Matthew, what you're going to find is you won't see some wise men. Or sorry, you'll see wise men. Whereas Luke, you're not going to have wise men. You're going to have shepherds. Whereas in Matthew, there's no shepherds. Again, interesting stuff. There's a star in Matthew. There's no star in Luke. You'd think Luke would at least bring up the star. That would have been a big deal. The stories, remove yourself from the historical telling for a moment and look at it as if you were Jewish. And when you do, the whole thing begins to make sense. The whole thing really does pop, right? If you are Luke, Luke is going to introduce Jesus, and he's going to bring in different characters all throughout this birth narrative. And I'll show you. He's going to introduce Abraham. He's going to introduce Joseph. The Queen of Sheba is going to be introduced. That story will be introduced there. Samuel, Pharaoh, right? All of these different stories. It's like the writer there, Luke, he's in the temple and he's looking at Torah and he's pulling all these stories. He's inserting them there so that the Jewish people will know Jesus is the next thing to get a hold of. He is going to be the hope that we center on now, right? This movement, this Jesus movement, this new way of living in the world is actually the old way we've just forgotten. Let's hold on to this new hope, this new reality. Kingdom of heaven is beyond literal walls, right? That's what Luke is trying to tell his people. Whereas Matthew, you're going to see Moses show up a lot. Moses and Pharaoh, right? And that's where you're going to have these connections. There's a census taken. How many babies are there? Male children. Herod's going to kill all these male babies, right? Same as Pharaoh. The story is going to be repeated. If you're Jewish, you're not asking, no, wait a second. Does that mean this story didn't really happen? Or that's not what you're asking. You're making an immediate connection. You're saying, oh, Jesus is like the next Moses. Jesus is going to lead our people out of captivity like Moses did. That's the reason for the similar story, right? He's inserting the story so that you'll make the connection to Jesus and Moses. Right? So good. So good. Here's other things that you may not have noticed before. Isaiah 63, nations will come to your light. Here's where the star is introduced, right? Where did the star come from? Why would they talk about a star, right? Is there literally a real huge star somewhere just above Bethlehem that people are going to? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. You decide. But here's where the idea was. If you're Jewish and you hear about a star, you're making the connection. Isaiah 60, nations will come to your light, kings to the brightness of your rising, right? That right there, you're making the connection if you're Jewish. Isaiah 60 verse 4, they all gather together. And again, Isaiah 60 was one of the most commonly read chapters in Isaiah. The Jewish people had this memorized because it was really saying when our people finally get there, when we finally have our kingdom back, this is what will happen. So they repeated this chapter over and over again. They knew it. And that's why they borrow from this chapter for this story. Isaiah 60, verse 4, they will gather together. They'll come to you. Your sons will come from afar. Your daughters will be carried in your arms. So good, right? Jesus is the next thing. Isaiah 65, verse 6, watch this one. The wealth of the nations will come to you. Camels, here we go. The multitude of camels will cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephath, all those from Sheba, here's the Queen of Sheba, will come. They will bring gold and what? Frankincense. Of course they will. Of course that's what's brought to Jesus. And will bear good news of the praises of the Lord. Yeah, all of this, they are taking from the old, they're inserting into the new. 1 Kings 10, 1 through 13. This is where the myrrh came from, right? Where's the myrrh? Well, read that. You'll find the Queen of Sheba. You'll find these ideas. That's where the myrrh comes from, right? It all makes sense when you begin understanding they are taking the old stories and they're combining them all in Jesus to show their people Jesus is the next movement. Jesus is the thing that's going to bring us hope. Yeah, so good. What about this one? What this connection always blows my mind. There's a king already on the throne for Israel, for the Jewish people in this first century, isn't there? Yeah, Herod. He even called himself king. He built a huge temple that looked just like David's so that he could tell his people, I am your king. I am the one you've been waiting for that's going to lead us into peace. And my way of doing it is by assimilating. We've heard that story before, right? So again, Jesus, the baby is born at the same time that a king is already in place. Does this sound familiar? Well, yeah, just like David, Jesus is anointed while another king is already on the throne, right? David is anointed by a foreigner, right? Samuel, while while Jesus is anointed by four wise men, foreigners, all while there's someone on the throne. These stories are inserted for a reason, and it's so good. It makes me think about this quote from Theodore Roosevelt. It says this: "We face the future with our past and our present as guarantors of the promises. And we are content to stand or fall by the record which we have made and are making." And so Israel's writing this for a really important purpose. Much like us, they are building on their present by looking back. Remembering, like taking the good, using it to shape the new, a hopeful future. That's why the stories are so important, right? They're putting this all in Jesus. Jesus is the new reality that can build from the past, right? Jesus again says, "I am Torah." The writers want you to know he is all of these things, all the stories, all of it put into one. We have a new way of viewing the world, and a new Moses, a new Abraham, a new Joseph, a new Joshua. We have this, a new David who has shifted and changed and broken through the wall that we might follow. Right? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really painful. It's going to be really difficult. But we as a nation are going to move through it so that we have a bright future. We can live that present kingdom now. We can hold on to the promise. So they look back and they build on what the past had given them. And I think a lot of us, we tell those stories, don't we? Stories to our kids about grandparents and great grandparents. We want to build up the values. We want to talk about how great things were back then so that our kids can hold on to those things and build a brighter new future now. We do this all the time, don't we? In hopes that the promise for bigger, better life is just around the corner for them. It's so beautiful. This is what the Israelites were doing. This is what the Jewish people were doing when they're writing Matthew and Luke in the birth narrative. And it's so good. So beautiful. So how do we take it home? I thought about this. How do we take it home? I think we learn to look at our past. Look at our past. And so I wanted to take a moment and do an activity with you. I want you to think about people. Think about people who have made a difference in your life, part of your family who have made like a direct impact on you, someone who you feel has kind of helped shape you in a powerful way. What I want you to do right now is I want you to write down those people, write them down on a piece of paper, and then write the traits that you feel they have passed down to you. Write the names and the traits they have passed down to you. This exercise was so interesting for me to do. It really opened me up. I wanted to start making some phone calls, thanking some of them. Next step, read them aloud. I chose to do that. And when I read it aloud the other morning, I thought, oh, like that's really pretty beautiful. Those traits that I brought up, I began feeling it like, oh, those are things that I have taken too. Those are traits that I have chosen to bring into my life. And maybe some of those traits my daughter, my son might also take on. Another thing, what positive and negative traits have you absorbed? Think about that, right? There are sometimes negative ones. And so with the negative, think about, do I want to hold on to some of those traits? Do I want to be the kind of parent that makes their kids feel like they're walking on eggshells all the time? Right? Some of those things we have to ask, is that worth absorbing? Or maybe that story dies. Maybe we don't pass that story along anymore. Yeah. And then number 4, last one, take time to celebrate those positive traits and stories handed down. And I think the best way to celebrate sometimes is just by taking time to call those people, thank them, retell the stories, right? Retell those moments with new people, new experiences. Build from what you have in the past to make a brighter, better future now. This is what Israel is doing when they're telling the story of the birth narrative in Matthew and Luke. Folks, this was a lot of fun. We have a couple more that we want to share with you about the birth narrative. I think it's a great way to celebrate this Christmas season. And if you are considering tax time soon, you're beginning to think, how do I help continue this great resource that we've been doing here at Ethos Online? Please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. We're a tax-deductible donation. We spend a lot of resources and time putting these together for you. And so we would ask that you consider joining us with your finances and helping us continue sharing these messages every week. And if you want to join us online for our community, we'd love for you to be a part of that. And as always, hit that subscribe button, share these videos, especially YouTube. And we'd love to talk to you and continue growing together. Everyone, we love you. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.